It can be said with certainty that all composers love writing for percussion.
Loud noises!
Composers and arrangers need to give percussionists very clear instructions to allow the musicians to play effectively. As well as a composer, I am a percussionist and play in a number of orchestras near where I live. So, speaking from both personal experience and discussions with fellow players, here are 10 percussion part writing tips for composers and arrangers. Number 1. List the instruments on the front page. It's good practice to provide each player with a list of all the instruments they need for a piece in the top left corner of their individual part. Although this may seem like a very minor point solely done to keep things a bit tidy,
housekeeping!
It immediately clarifies what each player needs, something that's particularly important for more substantial pieces like multi-movement suites or symphonies. Also, if an instrument can be shared with another player, do mention this. Then, the percussion section knows straight away if they must provide duplicates of a particular instrument instead of one. With tuned instruments, it's a good idea to specify pitches within the instrument list if applicable. Let's say you intend to score 4 tubular bells or chimes in your piece, but end up only using 3 different notes rather than an entire chromatic set. You can just indicate this on the part like this. Here the players know not to transport a full chromatic set of bells. This avoids unnecessary effort and unwanted additional costs for the orchestra, not to mention using up crucial space on stage.
Wasteful! You waste! Every penny counts!
It's worth putting the instrument currently being used in brackets at the top of a new page. This reminds the player what they should be playing after a page turn, particularly if they have to jump around the piece in rehearsal. Number 2. No cymbals.
No, pomegranates!
Using cymbals to represent percussion instruments was particularly in vogue in the 1970s. First, we must bear in mind that what we might call normal percussion notation isn't said to be fully standardised even today. Okay, composers usually write for a snare drum on the second space down on a 5-line stave, and all percussionists are familiar with this. But not all composers or publishers follow this rule. The issue of clarity arises when cymbals are used as the only way to identify an instrument. This could denote a snare drum to one composer, to another it could mean tenor drum, and to another it might mean snare drum without snares.
What does it mean? No one knows!
The main problem with cymbals is they're just less efficient. If you're using notation software anyway, it takes just as much time to type this or this before an instrument's entry than it does to find the correct symbol from a list and place it where you need it.
Down with this sort of thing! Careful now.
Also, symbols are not often accompanied by any text, so a player could, in the heat of the moment, misinterpret them.
I genuinely don't know what at all.
For example, this symbol could mean tubular bells, but I saw the same symbol being used in another piece where it signified a mark tree instead. Certainly, every orchestral percussionist I've spoken to hates cymbals, so just avoid using them. Number 3. Consistent instrument allocation. This is one major pet peeve of percussionists. In multi-movement works, percussionists may find that a composer will ask for the same instrument to be played by different players for apparently
No f***ing reason.
Say we have a piece that requires 3 percussionists, and in movement 1 the players play the following instruments. So far so good. However, in movement 2, the composer has chosen to distribute the parts like this. Whilst player 2 first used the tenor drum, player 3 now has to play it.
Why?
The only reason for this is the composer wanted to score for xylophone, whose first notes occur before the tenor drum, so this composer's logic was that the xylophone should be played by percussion 2 because it's the second instrument that plays, and then move the tenor drum over to percussion 3.
I thought you would be making a good decision, but you made a bad dog.
It would be far simpler to keep the tenor drum on player 2's line and put the xylophone in player 3's part. One composer in particular does this a lot in his music for wind band. Now, I'm not going to say who it is, but it is very irritating when players come across this, since it is completely avoidable.
These I can do without. These are the things I can do without these things.
This leads to a lot of additional work, like using multiple instruments unnecessarily, taping photocopies of parts together, or the players having to swap parts between movements, which looks messy in performance and is just an added nuisance.
These problems matter.
Generally, it really doesn't matter if player 3 plays before player 2. Percussion parts are not laid out with a kind of hierarchy in mind. Okay, the principal is likely to go for the part marked percussion 1, which is often the most difficult part, but not always. And percussion 4 does not mean whoever plays that part is a less skilled player compared to who is on percussion 3. So when you've written a fairly busy passage, Always refer back to earlier movements or sections to remind yourself who played what previously. Number 4. Group parts together when appropriate. It is sometimes preferable to create a new part in your score notation program which incorporates 2 percussion parts to be played by 2 players. Bass drum and cymbals is a classic example. Players are so used to reading standard orchestral rep parts from the Romantic and early 20th century periods in this way, and it will not present an issue. You can either lay out the part on 2 separate staves throughout, or they can share a stave. Again, the important thing is as long as it's clear who plays what, either of these methods are fine and you can even combine them. However, if the parts are complicated, or the instruments don't play together frequently, it's better to just separate them out. One frequent plea from percussionists is, don't print out separate single line parts for long pieces. If you're told you only have 3 percussionists available, and you've scored for 12 instruments to be shared between them, do not produce 12 separate parts. Use a 5-line stave for each percussionist. As well as being easier for the composer to extract the parts from the score, it looks more appealing to the players who have to sight read the music. Remember, there's a good chance your new 10-minute piece may not get as much rehearsal time as the symphony, which takes up most of the programme.
Well, times are tight.
It can sometimes be helpful to include a percussion score. This is where all the parts appear in one booklet using multiple staves. So let's say you have 2 or 3 players maximum, all the entries are fairly spread out, the music isn't very difficult or busy, and each player needs 1 or 2 instruments at the most. Here, a percussion score would be good to have alongside separate individual parts. This can be useful during rehearsals where time is very short. It also allows an ensemble that might be down 1 player in performance, let's say due to sudden illness, to play the piece successfully. If you do prepare a score, put an abbreviation of the instrument on each line either at the start of every system or somewhere within the first bar at the top of each page. It's unhelpful to only cite the player number, as percussionists don't really read parts in this way. Conversely, for a piece needing 4 or more players, I wouldn't bother with a percussion score, just give each player their own separate part. This leads to 0 ambiguity regarding who should play what and when. Occasionally, a composer gives permission for players to omit instruments in very densely scored passages. This can be found in concert band music, where a composer rightfully acknowledges that the number of available percussionists varies enormously from band to band. Number 5. Make the parts legible. You'd think this point would be so obvious to the extent that it doesn't need to be included in this list, but in the past I've played off parts where the printer ink is smudged, the notes themselves are too small to read, or they're just not legible.
Fucking state of it.
If you're writing a xylophone or marimba part which involves many ledger lines, spread the bars out slightly to avoid the ledger lines running into each other. This is easier to read than this. I use sibelius to notate much of my music and opt for a stave size of around 6.8 to 7 with between 8 and 10 lines per page and approximately 6 to 8 bars per line depending on what's happening in the piece. Players have given me good feedback on this layout, so as a result I've stuck with it over the years, so you could use this as a reference for your own score notation software. I'm not saying use these figures absolutely, it's just what's worked for me.
That's my opinion!
The reason for this is percussionists often have to read music on a stand several feet away from their instrument, whereas a string or woodwind player doesn't have to do this. Number 6. Put lots of cues in the parts. I'm sure we're all familiar with the joke of a percussionist having to sit around counting many rests in order to stand up, get ready to play one note in a 60-minute symphony, only for them to miss that note.
Because I'm not fucking laughing, Nicholas.
When we consider contemporary music, where we're more likely to encounter uneven phrase lengths or unexpected changes of harmony or mood, it's a good practice to provide frequent cues in each part. It's slightly frustrating when we see a part that looks like this. If we're looking at this part for the first time, anything could happen in those 40 bars. If those 40 bars appeared broken up like this, it makes the long periods of rest less arduous. Psychologically, there's always a nagging thought at the back of most musicians' minds that they could lose count during a long bout of rests. If you have 7, 10 or 16 bars to count in one sitting, that's far less daunting than having to count, say, 78 bars rest in one go. Once more, it's another thing musicians don't need to worry about in rehearsal or performance.
When will you learn that your actions have consequences?
I tend to stick to around 20 bars rest as a cautious maximum, but that's just personal preference. Also, remember to put in useful cues. Good instruments to cue frequently for percussionists are timpani, of course, low strings, low brass or violins, because percussionists often have a good view of those instruments from where they're sitting in the orchestra, or it's very obvious to hear when they play. A very quiet fourth horn pedal is not as helpful as a noticeable cello entry which might occur a few bars later. Another option for the percussion parts, or any orchestral part for that matter, is to follow a nice style being adopted by more and more composers these days, whereby an instrument's entry is shown in square brackets at the start of a set of rests. This is a good alternative if the cue you might want to copy is quite complicated. A related point to this is where to place rehearsal marks. It is advisable to put them in wherever there is a change of some sort, a change of orchestration, texture, a new instrument entry, a change of mood, a change of tempo, and so on. You can use letters, numbers, bar numbers, whatever your preferred system is, all fine. Do not insert a rehearsal mark every 5 or 10 bars. There are a number of published orchestral works which exist in this form. Musicians don't like this on the whole because they expect a natural arrival point when approaching a rehearsal figure. So if that figure lands midway through a phrase, it can be somewhat disorientating and confusing. Number 7. Give players time to change instruments. A common problem in percussion parts these days is composers underestimating the time it takes to move from one instrument to the next. Two common orchestral instruments that players appreciate being given a bit more time to prepare are cymbals and tambourine. If we have a part that asks for several suspended cymbals to be played in quick succession, it's likely the composer is expecting the percussionist to use the same pair of sticks on each cymbal to get a uniform sound. Or we might have a collection of instruments like toms, log drums and bongos. Again, this is fine since all the instruments would be positioned together anyway, and many stick manufacturers produce types of multi-percussion mallets which are very easily available. The problem is when we have a part like this. Here, the percussionist plays xylo for a bit, then has 2 beats to play the tam-tam, then 4 beats later play a 4-note chord on the marimba. Within the space of 2 beats, the player must put down the xylophone beaters, move to the tam-tam, pick up the tam-tam beater and get in a comfortable position, then strike the tam-tam to produce a good tone. After that, they've got 1 bar to damp the tam-tam because the composer has indicated this, move to the marimba, pick up 4 sticks, arrange them correctly in their hands, then play the marimba chord. Along the way, there is a danger that something may end up being compromised. The player may not strike the tam-tam in the best spot, or resort to playing the tam-tam with a xylo beater if the tempo is too fast, producing the wrong sound potentially. Depending on what comes before, the same mallets may need to be used on both xylo and marimba to avoid changing sticks, but then the tone of the marimba played with rubber mallets may not be what the composer wanted. If our composer here wanted the tam-tam to be played with a xylo mallet, and explicitly put that instruction in the music, that's fine because it is the specific sound being called for. So remember to be mindful of the different tone qualities instruments produce when played with different mallets. Number 8. Convenient page turns. Try to give players at least 2 bars or 3 bars to turn a page where possible. Since percussionists frequently must place their stands further away from them compared to other instrumentalists in the orchestra, parts that allow more time to turn pages means less haste and avoids players being taken off guard by a sudden instrument change happening over the page.
For like, this is a surprise!
This not only removes the potential hazard of dropped music, or other problems the player could do without, but it's simply one less thing for the player to be concerned about when playing the piece. Number 9. Avoid annoying timpani parts. Timpani are capable of much expression and tonal variety, and are tremendously versatile in any ensemble, large or small. They are, however, victim to one thing: copy and paste. One thing timpanists don't like is when they are presented with a part that looks like this, where it's clear the composer simply used copy and paste on the tuba or double bass part. This gives little regard to the actual capabilities of the timpani, and creates an unnecessarily complex part, plus it also doesn't look like a lot of thought went into what the timpani have to play. Okay, timpanists do like a challenge every now and then. Think of Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra or some modern film scores. But a consistently foot-happy part going on for ages and ages can get frustrating.
Oh, it's an absolute casserole down there.
And can result in the player needing to source extra drums to get all the notes. Sometimes they don't have access to these extra drums. Remember that each drum has a specific range, and drums sound at their best when set to pitches in the middle of that range. Lots of low pitches close together may not sound as clean as your computer software does when it plays back what you've written. Remember also that a small drum tuned low will sound different compared to a larger drum tuned to the same note. What's important is to take a step back and consider, do the timps need to double every single note in this passage? If it's not essential, you could give the timps accented notes only, or use them in tandem with concert toms or rototoms for potential changes of colour, which would be more interesting. And finally, number 10, orchestrate with care and purpose. I find some composers are guilty of a type of FOMO when scoring for percussion these days. They feel they must include a huge array of instruments just because they're writing a modern piece. This can result in instruments such as the marimba and tuned gongs being almost shoehorned into new works.
That's not ridiculous. That's not ridiculous to say that.
Also, with regard to semi-pro or amateur orchestras, there may not be the budget to cater for such an extensive list of percussion, which then harms the chance of future performances for the composer.
Well done.
Next, make sure the notes you write are important to the overall concept of your composition and you're not just asking the full section to play consistently for the sake of it. A lot of UK brass band music is guilty of this. Percussionists regularly come across extended and intricate passages of music involving 3 low timpani pitches, bass drum and toms, all playing simultaneously. The resultant texture just sounds muddy and players have to work really hard to achieve the right level of clarity.
Sorry, but that was really, really bad.
In this scenario, I'd prefer to score for concert toms and bass drum across 2 players initially, producing a clean and vibrant texture. I'd then give the timps a slightly different role, maybe shadowing certain elements in the tuba parts, or using them antiphonally against the rest of the band.
That's what I'm talking about!
If you're not sure of what you've written, just ask.
Did I ask you?
Percussionists have lots of respect for composers who are keen to learn how they can achieve what they want with input from players, as opposed to composers who write passages which are unidiomatic or unrealistic in their demands.
Well, he was a jerk anyway.
A composer who ignores all the points covered in this video is likely to make a percussion section as a whole think, "F this shit!" Equally, composers who research what they want and enter into a dialogue with players usually end up with a better sounding composition. Their percussion parts are more effectively written, allow players to change instruments smoothly with no stress, and leads to a more successful performance.
Now, do you understand everything I've said?
So, if you're a percussionist, please comment below on any other annoying things you may have encountered when playing new music.
Stop!